She guarded an old veteran at a bar. Minutes later, 80 Hells Angels had the whole area surrounded. Sarah Martinez had been working at Murphy's bar for 3 years, and she thought she'd seen everything. The small-town dive bar attracted all kinds of people: construction workers after long shifts, college students looking for cheap drinks, and locals who treated the place like their second home. But on this particular Thursday evening in October, something felt different. The autumn rain drummed against the windows as Sarah wiped down glasses behind the worn wooden bar. The usual crowd was thin tonight, just a few regulars nursing their beers and watching the football game on the old television mounted in the corner. That's when she noticed him, an elderly man sitting alone at the far end of the bar, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee that had long gone cold. The old man looked to be in his 70s, with silver hair and deep lines etched into his face that spoke of a hard life lived. He wore a faded military jacket, and Sarah could make out various patches and insignia that suggested he was a veteran. His eyes held a distant look, as if he was seeing something far beyond the confines of the dimly lit bar. What caught Sarah's attention wasn't just his solitary presence, but the way he kept glancing toward the door with an expression that mixed hope with resignation. Every time the bell above the entrance chimed, his head would turn expectantly, only to slump slightly when it wasn't whoever he was waiting for. As the evening wore on, Sarah noticed 3 younger men enter the bar. They were loud and clearly intoxicated, wearing leather jackets and carrying themselves with the swagger of people looking for trouble. They scanned the room like predators seeking prey, and their eyes settled on the old veteran sitting alone. The 3 men made their way over to where the veteran sat, surrounding his stool in a semicircle. Sarah couldn't hear their initial words over the music and conversation, but she could see the veteran's posture stiffen. His knuckles went white as he gripped his coffee cup, and he shook his head slowly at whatever they were saying. "Hey, old man," one of the troublemakers said, his voice now loud enough for Sarah to hear. "This is our spot. Why don't you find somewhere else to sit?" The veteran looked up at them with quiet dignity. "I'm not bothering anyone. Just having my coffee and minding my own business." "Well, your business is bothering us," another one sneered. "Look at you, wearing that old jacket like you're some kind of hero. What did you do, sweep floors at some army base?" Sarah felt her jaw clench. She'd dealt with drunk troublemakers before, but there was something particularly cruel about targeting an elderly veteran who was clearly just trying to enjoy a peaceful evening. The old man remained calm, but she could see the hurt in his eyes at their mocking words. The third troublemaker, seemingly the leader of the group, leaned in closer to the veteran. "Maybe you didn't hear us the first time, Grandpa. We want this spot and you're going to move." "I'm not looking for any trouble," the veteran replied quietly. "There are plenty of other seats in here. But we want this one," the leader pressed, his voice getting more aggressive. "And frankly, I don't think someone like you belongs in a place like this anyway." That was the moment Sarah decided she'd heard enough. She'd grown up in a military family. Her father had served 2 tours in Vietnam, and her brother was currently deployed overseas. The respect for veterans had been instilled in her from childhood, and she wasn't about to stand by and watch 3 bullies harass an old man who had probably sacrificed more for his country than they ever would. Sarah walked out from behind the bar, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. She was a small woman, barely 5 feet 4 inches tall, but she carried herself with confidence as she approached the group. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Is there a problem here?" The 3 men turned to look at her, and the leader smirked. "No problem, sweetheart. Just having a conversation with the old-timer here." "It looks more like harassment to me," Sarah replied, crossing her arms. "And I'm going to have to ask you to leave this gentleman alone." The leader laughed, and his friends joined in. "Or what, you're going to throw us out?" "If I have to," Sarah said, though she knew she had no chance of physically removing 3 grown men. "But first I'm going to call the police." "Go ahead," the leader challenged. "By the time they get here, we'll be long gone. But maybe we'll take Grandpa here with us for a little ride." The threat sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she stood her ground. She positioned herself between the troublemakers and the veteran, who looked up at her with surprise and gratitude. "Ma'am, you don't need to get involved," the old man said quietly. "I can handle this." "Nobody should have to handle this alone," Sarah replied, not taking her eyes off the 3 men. "Especially not someone who served our country." The leader's expression darkened. You know what? I think both of you need to learn some manners. As he reached out toward Sarah, the veteran suddenly stood up. Despite his age, there was still strength in his frame, and his voice carried an authority that made everyone pause. Son, he said calmly, I suggest you think very carefully about your next move. The leader hesitated, something in the old man's tone giving him pause, but his pride and the alcohol in his system pushed him forward. I'm not afraid of some broken-down old soldier, he snarled. That's when Sarah made a decision that would change everything. She pulled out her phone and started recording, making sure to capture the faces of all three troublemakers. Smile for the camera, gentlemen, she said. I'm sure your families and employers would love to see how you spend your evenings. The recording seemed to enrage the leader even more. He lunged forward, but before he could reach Sarah, the veteran stepped between them. What happened next surprised everyone in the bar. Despite his age, the old man moved with practiced precision, catching the attacker's wrist and using his own momentum against him. In seconds, the troublemaker found himself on the floor looking up in shock. 40 years in the Marines, the veteran said quietly. Some things you never forget. The other two troublemakers helped their friend to his feet, their bravado suddenly deflated. But as they headed toward the door, the leader turned back with a vicious look. This isn't over, old man. We know where you drink now. After they left, the bar fell silent except for the rain still pattering against the windows. Sarah looked at the veteran with new respect and he gave her a small, grateful smile. Thank you, miss. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Sarah replied. My father always taught me that we look out for those who looked out for us. As she returned to her duties behind the bar, Sarah had no idea that her act of kindness and courage would soon set in motion events that would bring 80 of the most feared motorcyclists in the country to this small town. The old man's story was far more complex than she could have imagined, and by morning Murphy's bar would be at the center of something extraordinary. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Murphy's bar early to prepare for another shift. The events of the previous evening replayed in her mind as she unlocked the front door and switched on the lights. She kept thinking about the old veteran and how smoothly he had handled that troublemaker. There was clearly more to him than met the eye. Around noon, she was surprised to see the same elderly man push through the door. He looked different in the daylight, more alert, more purposeful. He walked directly to the bar and took the same seat he'd occupied the night before. I wanted to thank you properly, he said, extending his hand. The name's Frank Williams. I didn't get a chance to introduce myself last night with all the excitement. Sarah Martinez, she replied, shaking his firm grip. And you don't need to thank me. Anyone would have done the same thing, Frank smiled sadly. You'd be surprised how few people actually would. Most folks just look the other way these days. As Sarah prepared Frank's coffee, she noticed he seemed more talkative than the previous evening. Maybe it was the daylight, or maybe their shared experience had broken down some barriers. You handled yourself pretty well last night, Sarah observed. Those Marines really did train you well. That they did, Frank nodded. But it wasn't just the Marines that taught me how to handle trouble. Life has a way of giving you all the education you need. There was something in his tone that made Sarah look up from the coffee machine. Frank was staring out the window, that same distant expression from the night before clouding his features. I haven't been entirely honest with you, Miss Sarah, Frank continued. See, I'm not just any old veteran. My past is complicated. Sarah set his coffee down and leaned against the bar. What do you mean? Frank took a long sip before answering. After I came back from Vietnam in 1971, I was angry, lost. The world had changed while I was gone, and I didn't know how to fit into it anymore. A lot of us felt that way back then. He paused, rolling the warm mug between his palms. I ended up joining a motorcycle club. Started out innocent enough. Just a bunch of veterans looking for brotherhood, for a place to belong. But things got complicated over the years. Sarah felt a flutter of curiosity mixed with concern. What kind of motorcycle club? The Hells Angels, Frank said quietly. I was a member for nearly 30 years. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. Everyone had heard of the Hells Angels, the notorious motorcycle club with chapters across the country, known for their fierce loyalty, their code of silence, and their reputation for handling problems their own way. I was never involved in anything truly bad, Frank continued quickly, seeing the shock on Sarah's face. Mostly I just rode with them, attended rallies, looked out for my brothers. But I won't lie to you, it was a different world with different rules. Sarah tried to process this information. The gentle, polite old man sitting in front of her had been part of one of the most infamous motorcycle clubs in America. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Frank's expression grew serious. "Because those 3 idiots from last night? They're not going to let this go. I've seen their type before. Bullies who can't handle being embarrassed, especially in front of witnesses. They'll be back, probably with friends." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "Are you trying to scare me?" "I'm trying to protect you," Frank replied earnestly. "You stuck your neck out for me last night, and now you might be in danger because of it. That's not something I can live with." Sarah studied his weathered face, seeing genuine concern in his eyes. "So what are you suggesting?" "I made some calls this morning," Frank said. "Reached out to some old friends. People I haven't spoken to in years, but who still remember what brotherhood means." "What kind of calls?" Frank pulled out an old flip phone and showed Sarah the screen. There were dozens of missed calls and text messages. Word travels fast in certain circles. When you've been part of something like the Angels, you're never really out. Family is family, even when you walk away. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. "Frank, what exactly did you tell these people?" "I told them that a young woman showed courage and kindness to an old brother who needed help. I told them she put herself at risk to protect someone she didn't even know. And I told them that because of her actions, she might now be in danger." The implications of what Frank was saying began to dawn on Sarah. "You're telling me that the Hells Angels are coming here? To this little town?" "Some of them are already on their way," Frank confirmed. "I tried to tell them it wasn't necessary, that I could handle it myself. But they wouldn't hear it. They said debt is debt, and when someone shows respect to a brother, that respect gets returned." Sarah sat down heavily on a bar stool. This was far more than she had bargained for when she decided to stand up to 3 drunk troublemakers. "How many are coming?" she asked weakly. Frank checked his phone again. "Last count I heard was about 80 riders from various chapters. They should start arriving this evening." 80? Sarah's voice cracked slightly. "Frank, this is a small town. People are going to panic. The police will get involved. This could turn into a disaster. That's why I'm here," Frank said calmly, "to make sure it doesn't. These men aren't coming here to cause trouble for innocent people. They're coming to make sure justice is served and to honor someone who showed honor." Sarah rubbed her temples, feeling a headache building. "This is insane. All I did was tell some jerks to leave you alone." "In my world, that means everything," Frank replied. "You showed loyalty to someone you didn't know, someone who couldn't offer you anything in return. That's the kind of character that demands respect." The door chimed, and both Sarah and Frank turned to see a police officer enter. Officer Mike Rodriguez had been a regular at Murphy's for years, and Sarah knew him well. "Morning, Sarah," Mike said, but his attention was focused on Frank. "Sir, I'm going to need to ask you some questions." Frank nodded calmly. "I figured you might. We got reports this morning about some unusual activity. Phone calls coming into town from various motorcycle clubs across 3 states. All asking about you, Mr. Williams." "They're just checking on an old friend," Frank replied. Mike's expression was skeptical. "Mr. Williams, I ran your name through our system this morning. Your record shows past association with the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. Now we're hearing rumors that members are heading this way. I need to know what's going on." Sarah looked back and forth between the 2 men, feeling caught in the middle of something much bigger than she understood. "Officer Rodriguez," Frank said respectfully, "I give you my word that no harm will come to anyone in this town. The people coming here are coming to pay respects, nothing more." "Respects for what?" Frank gestured toward Sarah. "This young lady showed me kindness last night when 3 men were trying to cause me trouble. In my world, that kind of loyalty means something. My old friends want to make sure she knows how much it's appreciated." Mike looked at Sarah with surprise. "What happened last night?" As Sarah recounted the events, she watched Mike's expression grow more concerned. When she finished, he shook his head slowly. "Sarah, do you understand what you've gotten yourself into?" "I'm beginning to," she replied quietly. Mike turned back to Frank. "Mr. Williams, how many are we talking about?" "Around 80 riders, give or take." Mike's radio crackled to life and the dispatcher's voice filled the bar. "All units be advised. Large convoy of motorcycles spotted on Highway 67, approximately 30 miles out and heading toward town." Frank checked his phone one more time. "Looks like the first group is ahead of schedule." Sarah felt her world spinning out of control. "In less than 24 hours, Her simple act of standing up for an old veteran had somehow triggered what appeared to be an invasion of one of the country's most notorious motorcycle clubs. "Frank," she said quietly. "What happens now?" The old man's eyes held a mixture of pride and concern. "Now we find out what happens when 80 Hells Angels decide to show their appreciation." Outside, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines could already be heard approaching on the wind. The rumble started as a distant whisper on the horizon, like thunder rolling across the plains, but as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder and more distinct. Sarah stood behind the bar, her hands trembling slightly as she polished the same glass for the 5th time, watching through the window as the first motorcycle appeared at the far end of Main Street. Officer Rodriguez had left to coordinate with the state police, and other officers were setting up roadblocks at the town's entrances. The usually quiet streets were now filled with concerned residents peering from their windows and stepping out of shops to see what was causing the growing noise. Frank remained calm at the bar, sipping his coffee as if 80 of the most feared motorcyclists in the country weren't about to descend on their small town. His old flip phone buzzed constantly with updates, and each message seemed to bring a small smile to his weathered face. "The first group is from the Denver chapter," Frank said, reading another text. "Good men. I rode with some of them back in the day." Sarah watched as the lead motorcycle turned onto Main Street, followed by another, then another. The riders wore leather jackets with the distinctive Death's Head logo on their backs, and their bikes gleamed despite the long journey. They moved in perfect formation like a military convoy. "Frank, I need to ask you something," Sarah said, setting down the glass she'd been polishing. "Are you sure they're just here to thank me? This seems like a lot of firepower for a simple appreciation visit." Frank's expression grew serious. "Sarah, you have to understand something about motorcycle club culture. When someone shows disrespect to a member, especially a veteran member, it's not just personal. It's an insult to the entire brotherhood. Those 3 punks from last night didn't just mess with me, they disrespected everything the club stands for." The first group of riders pulled up. Directly in front of Murphy's bar, Sarah counted 12 motorcycles, each one representing thousands of dollars worth of chrome and steel. The lead rider removed his helmet, revealing a graying beard and intense eyes that surveyed the area like a general assessing a battlefield. "That's Tommy Bear Morrison," Frank said quietly. "He's been president of the Denver chapter for 15 years. Good man, but you don't want to get on his bad side." Bear dismounted his bike and walked toward the bar with purpose. His massive frame filled the doorway as he entered, and his eyes immediately found Frank. "Frankie," Bear's voice boomed across the small space. "You old dog, you should have called sooner." The 2 men embraced like long-lost brothers, and Sarah could see genuine affection between them despite the intimidating circumstances. "Bear, I told everyone this wasn't necessary," Frank said. "I can handle 3 local troublemakers on my own." "Maybe you can," Bear replied, "but that's not the point. Nobody disrespects family and walks away clean." He turned to Sarah with surprising gentleness. "You must be the young lady who stood up for our brother here." Sarah nodded, trying to find her voice. "I'm Sarah." "Sarah," Bear repeated, as if committing the name to memory. "What you did took courage. Real courage. That means something in our world." More motorcycles roared past the windows, and Sarah could see the town's main street filling up with riders. Some wore colors from chapters she'd never heard of: Phoenix, Salt Lake City, even some from as far away as California and Texas. "How many chapters are represented here?" Sarah asked Frank. "Last I heard, about 15 different chapters from across the western states," Frank replied. "Word spread faster than I expected." Officer Rodriguez returned with backup, several state police vehicles, and even a sheriff's department SUV. Sarah watched through the window as the officers tried to figure out how to handle the situation. Dozens of motorcycles now lined both sides of Main Street, and more were arriving every few minutes. Bear noticed the police presence and chuckled. "Looks like we've got the local law enforcement a little nervous. Can you blame them?" Sarah asked. "This probably looks like an invasion to them." "In a way it is," Bear admitted, "but not the kind they're thinking. We're not here to cause trouble for regular folks. We're here to handle a specific problem." Frank's phone buzzed again, and his expression grew concerned as he read the message. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "The 3 from last night," Frank said. "They've been bragging around town about what they're going to do to the old man and his girlfriend when they see them again. Apparently they've recruited some friends. Bear's expression darkened. How many friends? Sounds like they've got about a dozen guys ready to cause trouble, Frank replied. They're planning to come back here tonight when the bar is busy. Sarah felt her stomach drop. Frank, maybe we should just close the bar early tonight. Avoid the confrontation altogether. That's not how this works, darling, Bear said, his voice gentle but firm. Running away just encourages bullies to keep bullying. Sometimes you have to make a stand. More riders entered the bar, each one greeting Frank like family returning from a long journey. Sarah was amazed by the respect they showed him. These were hard men with rough exteriors, but their treatment of Frank was almost reverent. Frank was our sergeant-at-arms for 12 years, one rider explained to Sarah. He kept the peace, settled disputes, and made sure the club stayed true to its values. We owe him more than we could ever repay. As the afternoon wore on, the scene outside became increasingly surreal. The small town's main street looked like something from a movie set. Dozens of gleaming motorcycles lined the road, and leather-clad riders moved between them, checking equipment and talking in small groups. Local residents gathered on the sidewalks, some fearful but others clearly fascinated by the spectacle. Sarah noticed several people taking pictures with their phones, probably posting to social media about the invasion of bikers in their quiet town. The mayor wants to talk, Officer Rodriguez announced as he entered the bar. He's asking for a meeting with whoever's in charge here. Bear laughed. Nobody's in charge. We're just a bunch of friends visiting an old brother. With respect, sir, that's not how this looks from the outside. The mayor is concerned about public safety, and frankly, so am I. Frank stood up from his stool. Officer, I understand your concerns, but I give you my word. Nobody here is looking for trouble with law-abiding citizens. We're here to handle a specific situation involving 3 men who made threats. What kind of threats? Rodriguez asked. The kind that involve harm to Miss Sarah here, Bear said, his voice taking on a harder edge. Threats that can't be ignored. Rodriguez looked around the bar, now filled with members of one of the most notorious motorcycle clubs in America, all gathered to protect a bartender who had shown kindness to their old friend. This is unprecedented, he muttered. Officer, Sarah said, I appreciate your concern, but these people are here because of something I chose to do. I stood up for Frank, and now they're standing up for me. Maybe instead of seeing them as a threat, we should see them as allies. Rodriguez shook his head. Ma'am, with respect, you don't understand what you're dealing with here. These aren't just motorcycle enthusiasts. This is the Hells Angels. And they're also veterans, fathers, and working men who live by a code of honor, Frank said quietly. Judge them by their actions here today, not by what you've heard on the news. Outside, the rumble of more motorcycles announced the arrival of another group. Through the window, Sarah could see the street was now completely lined with bikes, and riders were having to park in the lot behind the bar. Bear checked his watch. Sun goes down in about 4 hours. If those boys are planning to make their move tonight, they'll probably show up around closing time when they think the crowd will give them cover. What's the plan? Sarah asked, surprised by her own calm tone. Simple, Bear replied. We wait. When they show up, we have a conversation with them about the proper way to treat ladies and veterans. After that conversation, I don't think they'll be bothering anyone in this town again. Frank placed a reassuring hand on Sarah's shoulder. You don't have to worry about anything, Miss Sarah. These men have traveled hundreds of miles to make sure you're safe. Nobody's going to lay a finger on you. Sarah looked around the bar at the leather-clad figures, realizing that her simple act of kindness had created something extraordinary. Tomorrow, the story would probably make national news. But tonight she was under the protection of 80 of the most loyal men she'd ever met. Outside, the sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon, and everyone in Murphy's bar knew that when darkness fell, there would be a reckoning. As darkness settled over the small town, Murphy's bar had transformed into something resembling a military command center. The 80 Hells Angels members weren't drinking or causing disturbances as many locals had feared. Instead, they sat quietly at tables and along the bar, their eyes constantly scanning the windows and entrances. The atmosphere was tense but controlled, like a coiled spring waiting for the right moment to release. Sarah moved behind the bar, serving coffee and soft drinks to the bikers. She had expected them to order beer and whiskey, but Bear had made it clear that everyone needed to stay sharp and sober tonight. This wasn't a party. It was protection detail. You're handling this better than most people would, said a rider named Jake, who wore patches indicating he was from the Phoenix chapter. Most folks would be terrified having this many of us in one place. I was terrified at first, Sarah admitted. But then I realized you're all here because you care about Frank. That says something about the kind of men you are. Frank sat in the same spot he'd occupied for the past 2 nights, but now he was surrounded by brothers who hung on his every word. Sarah could see why he commanded such respect. Even in his 70s, there was an authority about him that demanded attention. Movement outside called out a biker stationed near the window. 3 vehicles just pulled into the lot across the street. Bear immediately stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow across the bar. How many occupants? Hard to tell in the dark, but I count at least 10, maybe 12 people getting out. Frank checked his old flip phone. It's 9:47. Bar doesn't close until midnight, so they're coming early. Probably hoping to catch us off guard. Sarah felt her heart rate increase as she watched through the window. She could make out the shapes of men gathering in the parking lot across the street, some of them holding what looked like baseball bats and tire irons. There's our 3 friends from last night, Bear observed, pointing to the group's apparent leaders. And they brought backup, just like you said they would. 12 against 80, Jake muttered. Either they're very stupid or very drunk. Probably both, Frank replied. Bullies don't usually think things through very carefully. The group across the street seemed to be having an argument. Sarah could see them gesturing wildly, and it was clear that some of them were having second thoughts about their plan. The sight of 80 motorcycles lined up along Main Street had probably not been part of their original strategy. They're moving, announced the lookout. Sure enough, the group was crossing the street heading directly for Murphy's bar. The 3 ringleaders from the previous night walked in front, trying to project confidence, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in their movements. Everyone stay calm, Bear instructed. Let them make the first move. We're not here to start trouble, just to finish it. The door of Murphy's bar swung open, and the 3 troublemakers from the previous night walked in, followed by 9 other men of various ages. They stopped short when they saw the bar filled with leather-clad bikers, all of whom turned to look at the newcomers with expressions that ranged from amusement to barely contained hostility. The leader from the previous night, who Sarah now noticed had a black eye that hadn't been there before, tried to maintain his swagger despite being obviously outgunned. Well, he said, his voice carrying less confidence than his words suggested. Looks like Grandpa called in some friends. Frank slowly stood up from his stool and the entire bar fell silent. Boys, he said quietly, you've got about 10 seconds to turn around and walk out of here before this gets unpleasant. We're not afraid of a bunch of old bikers, the leader replied, though his voice cracked slightly. This is between us and you, old man. And your girlfriend here. That was the wrong thing to say. Sarah watched as every single Hell's Angel in the bar stood up simultaneously, the sound of chairs scraping against the floor creating an ominous symphony. The 12 troublemakers suddenly looked very small and very outnumbered. Bear stepped forward, his 6'4" frame towering over the lead troublemaker. Son, you just made a very serious mistake. Nobody talks about this lady with disrespect, not in front of us. The leader tried to stand his ground, but Sarah could see sweat beading on his forehead. This is America. We can say whatever we want. You can, agreed a biker from the Sacramento chapter, but then we can respond however we want. Several of the troublemakers' companions were already backing toward the door, clearly wanting no part of what was developing. The smart ones among them had probably realized that their numerical disadvantage was so severe that any conflict would end very badly for them. Look, one of the newcomers said, maybe we should just leave. This isn't worth it. Shut up, Danny, the leader snapped. We came here to teach these people a lesson, and that's what we're going to do. Frank shook his head sadly. Son, the only lesson being taught here tonight is one you're about to learn. When you disrespect good people, there are consequences. What are you going to do, beat us up? The leader challenged, though his voice betrayed his fear. There are witnesses here. That bartender is recording everything. Sarah looked down and realized she had indeed been recording on her phone, though she couldn't remember pulling it out. Her hands seemed to be operating on autopilot. Who said anything about beating anyone up? Bear asked with a dangerous smile. We're just here to have a conversation. The conversation, however, was clearly over. The 9 men who had followed the 3 ringleaders were already heading for the door, muttering apologies and excuses as they fled. Within seconds, only the original 3 troublemakers remained, looking increasingly isolated and vulnerable. "Your friends seem smarter than you are," Frank observed. The second troublemaker, the one who had mocked Frank's military service the night before, finally found his voice. "Look, maybe we got a little carried away last night. No hard feelings, right?" "Hard feelings?" repeated Jake from Phoenix. "You threatened this lady and disrespected a veteran. In our book, that's not something you just walk away from. What do you want from us?" the third troublemaker asked, his earlier bravado completely gone. Bear looked around the room at his fellow bikers as if taking a poll. Then he turned back to the 3 men. "First, you're going to apologize to Miss Sarah here for your threats and disrespectful behavior. Second, you're going to apologize to Frank for mocking his service to this country. And third, you're going to promise that you'll never bother either of them again." "That's it?" the leader asked, surprised. "That's it," Bear confirmed. "We're not unreasonable men. We just want to make sure everyone understands the situation clearly." The 3 men looked at each other, clearly weighing their options. The alternative to apologizing was facing the combined wrath of 80 Hell's Angels, which wasn't really an alternative at all. The leader stepped forward first, his eyes on the floor. "Miss, I'm sorry for what I said last night and for threatening you. That was wrong." His 2 companions quickly followed suit, offering stumbling apologies to both Sarah and Frank. The words seemed genuine, born more from fear than remorse. But Sarah accepted them graciously. "And you promise to leave both of us alone from now on?" Frank asked. "Yes, sir," all 3 replied in unison. "Good," Bear said. "Now there's just one more thing. You boys are going to spread the word around town that Miss Sarah here is under our protection. Anyone who has a problem with her has a problem with all of us. Are we clear?" The 3 men nodded vigorously and began backing toward the door. "Oh, and boys," Frank called out just before they reached the exit, "if I hear about you bothering anyone else in this town, anyone at all, we won't be having another conversation. We'll be having something else entirely." The door swung shut behind the 3 troublemakers and the bar remained silent for several long moments. Then slowly the bikers began sitting back down, and the tension in the room dissipated like air leaving a balloon. Sarah realized she had been holding her breath and let out a long exhale. "That's it? It's over?" "It's over," Bear confirmed. "Those boys won't be bothering you or anyone else anytime soon." Frank returned to his stool and picked up his coffee cup with steady hands. Sometimes the threat of violence is more effective than violence itself. Those 3 learned a valuable lesson tonight without anyone getting hurt. The next morning, Sarah arrived at Murphy's bar expecting to find the town back to normal, with the Hell's Angels having disappeared into the night like something from a dream. Instead, she discovered that more than half of the bikers were still there. Their motorcycles still lined up along Main Street like a chrome and steel parade. She found Frank at his usual spot, but now he was surrounded by photo albums and old letters that the bikers had brought to share with him. Stories were being exchanged, memories relived. And Sarah realized she was witnessing something special, a reunion of brothers who hadn't seen each other in years. "We couldn't just leave without spending some real time with Frankie," Bear explained when Sarah expressed surprise at their continued presence. "Some of these guys haven't seen each other since the early 90s. This is like a family gathering." As Sarah prepared coffee for the group, she listened to their stories. These weren't the dangerous criminals that movies and television had led her to expect. They were mechanics and construction workers, fathers and grandfathers, veterans and small business owners. Many had traveled hundreds of miles not just to protect her and Frank, but to reconnect with old friends. "Frank saved my life in 1987, said a biker named Tommy from the Salt Lake chapter. "I was going through a rough divorce, drinking too much, making stupid decisions. Frank sat me down and talked sense into me, made me realize I was throwing my life away." Another rider, an older man named Pete, nodded in agreement. Frank was always the voice of reason. When disputes came up between chapters or when someone was making trouble, Frank was the one they called to mediate. He had a gift for helping people see the bigger picture. Sarah began to understand why Frank commanded such respect. He wasn't just a former member. He had been a leader, a peacemaker, someone who embodied the positive aspects of brotherhood while steering others away from destructive paths. Around noon, Officer Rodriguez returned with what appeared to be a television news crew. Sarah's heart sank as she realized their small-town drama was about to become a media circus. "Ma'am," "There are reporters outside who want to interview you about last night," Rodriguez informed her. "Word got out about what happened here, and now it's becoming a national story." Through the window, Sarah could see a news van with satellite equipment, and more were arriving. The peaceful morning was about to become chaos. "Do I have to talk to them?" Sarah asked. "No," Bear interjected. "You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to talk to. That's your right." Frank looked troubled by this development. "Sarah, I never wanted this to become a spectacle. I just wanted to make sure you were safe." "It's okay, Frank. Maybe it's actually a good thing. People should know what really happened here." The news crews were persistent, but the Hells Angels formed a protective barrier around the bar, politely but firmly keeping the reporters at a respectful distance. Sarah watched in amazement as Bear calmly explained to a pushy journalist that she would give interviews when and if she was ready. Later that afternoon, Sarah did agree to speak with a reporter from the local newspaper, a woman named Jessica Chen who had covered the community for years and had a reputation for fair reporting. "This is an incredible story," Jessica said as she set up her recording equipment. "A bartender stands up for an elderly veteran, and 80 Hells Angels come to town to protect her. It sounds like something from a movie." "It still doesn't feel real to me," Sarah admitted. 3 days ago, my biggest concern was whether we had enough beer for the weekend crowd." Jessica interviewed several of the bikers as well, and Sarah was impressed by how articulate and thoughtful they were. They spoke about loyalty, brotherhood, and the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. "The media always focuses on the negative stories about motorcycle clubs," Bear explained to Jessica. "But they never talk about the charity rides we organize, the money we raise for veterans' causes, or the times we step in to help when someone's in trouble. This situation with Sarah is just who we are. We protect family, and she became family the moment she protected Frank." As the day wore on, something unexpected began to happen. Local residents, initially fearful of the large biker presence, started approaching the bar to meet the visitors. Word had spread about how peacefully the confrontation had been resolved, and curiosity began to overcome apprehension. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman who lived across from the bar, brought over homemade cookies. "I heard you boys traveled a long way to help our Sarah," she said to Bear. "Thought you might be hungry." A group of local veterans, led by a man named Bill who had served in Desert Storm, came by to shake hands with Frank and the other riders. "We heard about what those punks said to you about your service," Bill told Frank. "That was unacceptable. Thank you for handling it the way you did." Sarah watched in amazement as her small town and the visiting bikers found common ground. Children pressed their faces against the windows to see the impressive motorcycles, and their parents found themselves chatting with the riders about everything from engine specifications to family photos. "You know what this reminds me of?" Frank said to Sarah as they watched Bear patiently explaining motorcycle maintenance to a curious teenager. "This reminds me of what America used to be like. People looking out for each other, standing up for what's right, finding common ground despite their differences." By evening, what had started as a tense situation had transformed into something like a block party. The mayor, who had been concerned about public safety the day before, stopped by to thank the bikers for their peaceful conduct and to invite them to visit again under happier circumstances. "I have to admit," Mayor Johnson said to Sarah, "when I heard that 80 Hells Angels were coming to town, I was preparing for the worst. Instead, you've brought our community together in a way I haven't seen in years." As the sun began to set, the bikers started preparing for departure. They had jobs to return to, families waiting for them, and lives to resume. But Sarah could tell that the bonds formed over the past 2 days would last. "This isn't goodbye," Bear told Sarah as he prepared to mount his motorcycle. "You're part of the family now. That means if you ever need anything anywhere in the country, you've got people you can call." He handed her a business card with his contact information and the symbols of several motorcycle clubs. "You probably won't ever need this, but it's good to know it's there." Frank was having his own emotional farewells, embracing men he might not see again for years. Sarah could see tears in his eyes as his old brothers climbed onto their motorcycles and prepared to head back to their respective homes. "Thank you," Sarah said to Bear before he left. "Not just for protecting me, but for showing me what real brotherhood looks like." "Thank you," Bear replied, "for reminding us why brotherhood matters in the first place." As the motorcycles roared to life and began pulling away from Murphy's bar, Sarah realized that her life had been changed forever. She had learned about courage, loyalty, and the unexpected places where you can find family. The small-town bartender who had simply tried to do the right thing had become part of something much larger than herself. Frank remained at the bar, watching his old friends disappear into the distance. For the first time since Sarah had known him, he looked truly at peace. "Do you regret anything that happened?" Sarah asked him. Frank smiled and shook his head. "The only thing I regret is that it took this long for me to realize that doing the right thing always brings the right people into your life." 6 months later, Murphy's Bar had become something of a legend. The story of Sarah Martinez and the 80 Hells Angels had been featured on national news, in magazines, and even in a documentary about unlikely friendships. But for Sarah, the real impact wasn't the media attention or the curious tourists who sometimes stopped by hoping to hear the story firsthand. The real change was in the relationships that had formed and the lessons she had learned. Frank had become a daily fixture at the bar. No longer the lonely old man sitting by himself, but a beloved regular who always had visitors. Former Hells Angels members from across the country would stop by when they were passing through, turning Murphy's into an unofficial reunion spot for veterans and bikers alike. The walls were now decorated with photographs, patches, and mementos from motorcycle clubs around the nation. The 3 troublemakers from that fateful night had kept their promise. Not only had they left Sarah and Frank alone, but word around town was that they had all 3 gotten jobs and seemed to be making genuine efforts to turn their lives around. The leader, whose name Sarah had learned was Kevin, had even stopped by one evening to apologize again, this time sober and clearly sincere. "I was angry at the world," Kevin had explained to Sarah and Frank. "Lost my job. Girlfriend left me, felt like everything was falling apart. I was looking for someone to blame, someone weaker to pick on. What happened here made me realize I was becoming someone I didn't want to be." The incident had also brought unexpected changes to the town itself. The mayor had organized a Veterans Appreciation Day, inspired by the respect he had witnessed the bikers show to Frank and other local veterans. Local businesses had started a fund to help aging veterans with home repairs and medical expenses. The story of one night at Murphy's Bar had somehow awakened the community's awareness of the heroes living quietly among them. Sarah had received job offers from bars and restaurants across the country, all wanting to capitalize on her fame. Television producers had approached her about reality shows, and a publisher had inquired about book rights to her story. She had turned them all down, choosing instead to stay at Murphy's Bar in the town that had become her true home. "Why would I leave?" she had asked her sister during one of their phone conversations. "This is where my family is," and it was true. Frank had become like a grandfather to her, offering wisdom and stories from his long life. The regular customers at Murphy's had rallied around her during the media circus, protecting her privacy and treating her not like a celebrity but like the neighbor she had always been. Even some of the Hells Angels had become genuine friends, staying in touch through phone calls and social media. Bear had visited twice, both times bringing his wife Martha, who had become fast friends with Sarah. "I told Bear that any woman brave enough to stand up to 3 drunk men to protect an old veteran was someone I needed to meet," Martha had said during her first visit. The friendship with the motorcycle club members had opened Sarah's eyes to a world she never knew existed. She learned about their annual charity rides, their support for veterans' causes, and the genuine brotherhood that bound them together. She had even attended a rally in Colorado, where she was treated like visiting royalty and met hundreds of people who had heard her story. Frank's health had improved dramatically over the months. The loneliness and isolation that had marked his earlier visits to the bar had been replaced by purpose and connection. He had started volunteering at the local Veterans Center, using his experience to help other former service members adjust to civilian life. His military stories, once told to an empty bar, now captivated audiences of young people who hung on his every word. "You saved me as much as I saved you that night," Frank had told Sarah during one of their quiet conversations. "I was just existing before, waiting to die. Now I feel like I have a reason to be here." The bar itself had been renovated with donations from motorcycle clubs and grateful community members. New lighting, fresh paint, and comfortable seating had transformed the dive bar into a welcoming community gathering place. A small plaque by the door read, "Murphy's Bar, where courage meets brotherhood," donated by the Hells Angels Denver chapter. Sarah had also grown personally from the experience. The shy, conflict-avoiding woman who had once worried about confronting drunk customers had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She had started taking self-defense classes and had even learned to ride a motorcycle, a skill taught to her by Bear during one of his visits. "Confidence looks good on you," her friend Lisa had observed. "You carry yourself differently now." The story had also inspired others across the country. Sarah regularly received letters and emails from people who had heard about what happened at Murphy's bar and had been motivated to stand up for others in their own communities. A teacher in Ohio had defended an elderly janitor from bullying students. A store clerk in Texas had protected a disabled customer from harassment. Each story proved that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they chose courage over comfort. On the first anniversary of the incident, the town organized a celebration that drew visitors from hundreds of miles away. Dozens of Hell's Angels members returned, along with veterans groups, local families, and people who had simply been inspired by the story. Frank was given a key to the city, and Sarah was presented with a Community Service Award. During the ceremony, Mayor Johnson spoke about how one act of kindness had transformed their town. Sarah Martinez reminded us that heroism doesn't require superpowers or special training. Sometimes it just requires the willingness to do what's right even when it's scary. Frank had the final word during the celebration. Standing before the crowd gathered in the town square, the old Marine spoke with the same quiet dignity that had impressed Sarah that first night. "A lot of people have called Sarah a hero," he said, "and she is. But what makes her truly special isn't just the courage she showed that night. It's the way she's lived every day since then, treating everyone who walks into that bar with dignity and respect. She didn't just stand up for me, she showed all of us what it means to stand up for each other." As the celebration wound down and the visitors began to depart, Sarah found herself back at Murphy's bar, wiping down the same bar where it all started. Frank sat in his usual spot and Bear was sharing stories with a group of local veterans. "Any regrets?" Bear asked Sarah, echoing the question she had asked Frank months earlier. Sarah looked around the bar at the faces of people who had become family, at the photographs and mementos that told the story of an extraordinary friendship, and at Frank, whose eyes now held hope instead of loneliness. "Not a single one," she replied. "I've learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply care about someone else." Everything good that's happened since that night started with that simple choice. Frank raised his coffee cup in a toast. To Sarah Martinez, who proved that one person's courage can change everything. Bear raised his own cup. To brotherhood in all its forms. As they sat together in the warm glow of Murphy's bar, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed. She had gained a reputation, a story that would be told for years to come, and friendships that would last a lifetime. But most importantly, she had learned that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, creates ripples that extend far beyond what you can imagine. The old veteran was no longer alone. The small town had rediscovered its sense of community, and Sarah had found her place in a brotherhood that transcended the boundaries of blood, geography, and expectation. All because she had made a simple choice to stand up for someone who needed help. Sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin with the most ordinary decisions to simply do what's right.